From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We
send a message to the whole world again. We will not target Turkey, but if they insist on attacking us and occupying our lands, we will trigger our right in defending our project, ourselves, until the last drop of blood. We are ready to face any kind of attack.
As Turkey launches a ground and air assault on northern Syria, the Kurdish population is vowing to resist the offensive. Thousands of civilians are fleeing. Turkey's attack comes just days after President Trump ordered U.S. troops to fall back from their positions in northern Syria and abandon support of their Kurdish allies. Trump is defending his decision despite bipartisan criticism in Washington.
Now, the Kurds are fighting for their land, just so you understand. They're fighting for their land. And as somebody wrote in a very, very powerful article today, they didn't help us in the Second World War. They didn't help us with Normandy, as an example. They mentioned names of different battles.
Then we look at the disturbing death of Kaisara Stops Pretty Places, a Native American teenager who was found dead in Montana in August, just 2 weeks after her 18th birthday. She is among at least 27 Indigenous girls and women reported missing or murdered over the last years in Bighorn County. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Turkey launched an aerial and ground assault Wednesday in northern Syria, targeting Kurdish-controlled areas, just days after President Trump ordered U.S. troops to fall back from their positions on the Turkish-Syrian border. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reports at least 16 Kurds have been killed so far. Turkey claims the death toll is over 100. Fear is also growing. The Turkish assault could lead to the escape of ISIS fighters imprisoned in northern Syria. The New York Times is reporting the U.S. military has moved several dozen Islamic State prisoners to more secure locations. The European Union has warned Turkey's hostilities would, quote, further undermine the stability of the whole region. The UN Security Council is expected to meet later today. On Wednesday, President Trump described Turkey's assault as a bad idea, but defended his decision by saying the Kurds didn't help us with Normandy.
Now, the Kurds are fighting for their land, just so you understand. They're fighting for their land. And as somebody wrote in a very, very powerful article today, they didn't help us in the Second World War. They didn't help us with Normandy, as an example. They mentioned names of different battles.
When asked what would happen if ISIS prisoners were freed, he responded, they'll go to Europe. We'll have more on the Turkish offensive after headlines. In Washington, the White House Budget Office said Wednesday it will not comply with a congressional subpoena for documents relating to Ukraine. This comes one day after the White House said it would refuse to cooperate with the impeachment probe. The State Department has also blocked the U.S. ambassador to the European Union from speaking to the 3 congressional committees leading the inquiry. This is House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff speaking Wednesday.
The failure to produce this witness, the failure to produce these documents, we consider yet additional strong evidence of obstruction of the constitutional functions of Congress, a co-equal branch of government.
Meanwhile, presidential hopeful Joe Biden called for President Trump's impeachment for the first time Wednesday.
Donald Trump has violated his oath of office, betrayed this nation, and committed impeachable acts. To preserve our Constitution, our democracy, our basic integrity, he should be impeached.
Former Vice President Joe Biden is among the last of the major 2020 Democratic presidential contenders to call for Trump's impeachment. President Trump is facing dozens of new allegations of sexual assault and other inappropriate sexual behavior. That's according to a new book called All the President's Women, Donald Trump and the Making of a Predator. The book includes 43 new allegations. That's on top of the already 24 accusations of attempted rape, sexual assault, rape, and forced groping that President Trump is already facing. In a newly released excerpt of the book, a woman named Karen Johnson says Trump hid behind a tapestry at Mar-a-Lago, then grabbed her and forcibly kissed her without her consent at a New Year's Eve party in the early 2000s. She said, quote, "I was so scared because of who he was. I don't even know where it came from. I didn't have a say in the matter," unquote. Meanwhile, former NBC Today Show host Matt Lauer has denied accusations that he raped NBC producer Brooke Nevels in a hotel room in Sochi, Russia in 2014 as they covered the Winter Olympics. The accusations are detailed in Ronan Farrow's new book, Catch and Kill. Nevels called Lauer's denial a case study in victim blaming. In Germany, a heavily armed anti-Semitic gunman killed 2 people outside a synagogue in the eastern city of Halle on Wednesday as congregants observe Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism. The gunman live-streamed the attack, spewing misogynistic, racist, and anti-Semitic language before he tried to force his way into the synagogue. The door was locked. He shot a woman outside, then drove to a nearby kebab shop and opened fire. Leaders of the Jewish community say there were no police stationed outside the synagogue at the time of the attack, despite the synagogue's repeated requests for security. Anti-Semitic crimes and xenophobic hate crimes have increased by almost 20% in Germany over the past year. The United Nations has accused the U.S. military of killing at least 30 Afghan civilians in airstrikes targeting drug laboratories in western Afghanistan in May. The Pentagon disputes the United Nations findings, claiming the drug lab workers were members of the Taliban. The laboratories were mostly producing methamphetamine. The United States has spent over $8 billion on anti-drug operations during the ongoing U.S. war in Afghanistan, the longest war in U.S. history. In Iraq, Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi has announced he will reshuffle his cabinet in an effort to quell massive nationwide protests over government corruption and lack of jobs. Amnesty International says more than 150 people have been killed in the government's brutal crackdown. Activists report protesters being shot and killed by snipers and arrested at hospitals. Journalists have also reported being harassed and intimidated. Protests have also erupted in Algeria in recent weeks ahead of elections in December. Over 100 student protesters were arrested Tuesday as the government intensified its crackdown. The activists are protesting corruption, the jailing of opposition leaders, and the army's powerful role in national politics. In Egypt, the family of prominent Egyptian dissident Alaa Abdel Fattah says he has been beaten, threatened, and abused in custody since being arrested late last month amid an anti-government protest. The Egyptian authorities have arrested more than 2,000 people since the protests began. To see our discussion about what's happening in Iraq, you can go to democracynow.org, as we spoke to Democracy Now! Correspondent Sharif Abdel-Quddus. In Ecuador, a national strike paralyzed parts of the country Wednesday as indigenous groups, students, labor unions, and others continue their massive anti-austerity protests.
We do not want President Moreno's economic measures. We do not want him as president. And all of those who are in favor of those measures are against the people.
The protests began after Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno ended a decades-old fuel subsidy program last week as part of a so-called reform plan imposed by the International Monetary Fund after Ecuador took a $4.2 billion loan from the IMF earlier this year. To see our coverage of Ecuador, go to democracynow.org. In Argentina, dozens of indigenous women locked themselves inside the Ministry of the Interior in Buenos Aires Wednesday night, demanding the Argentine government respect the rights and autonomy of indigenous communities. The activists also denounced what they referred to as the ecocide of their land at the hands of capitalism, racism, and patriarchy. In Honduras, hundreds of people protested Wednesday against President Juan Orlando Hernandez and accused him of having ties to drug traffickers. The Honduran president's brother, Tony Hernandez, is on trial in New York City on accusations of trafficking tons of cocaine through Honduras, bound for the United States. He's also accused of having personally accepted a $1 million bribe meant for President Hernandez from the notorious Mexican drug lord known as El Chapo. Back in the United States, the FBI has carried out thousands of unconstitutional warrantless searches of the National Security Agency's vast computer archives, including the protected personal data of U.S. citizens and residents. That's according to a ruling last October by the Secretive Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court that was declassified this week. In the partially redacted ruling, Judge James Boasberg determined the FBI failed to meet minimum legal standards to protect people's Fourth Amendment rights to privacy. On one day alone in December 2017, the FBI illegally queried the NSA's database nearly 7,000 times using people's Social Security numbers. The United States has blacklisted 28 Chinese companies, government offices, and security bureaus over their alleged role in China's mass imprisonment of Muslim Uyghurs and other minority groups in the far western region of Xinjiang. The U.S. Commerce Department said, quote, "These entities have been implicated in human rights violations and abuses in the implementation of China's campaign of repression, mass arbitrary detention, and high-technology surveillance," unquote. The move comes days before trade talks between the U.S. and China. And Extinction Rebellion protests are continuing around the globe, with nonviolent actions demanding urgent action on the climate crisis. This morning, protesters blocked roads leading to London City Airport and held a sit-in protest inside a terminal, disrupting flights. In central London, hundreds of mothers with babies blocked traffic and held a nurse-in on Wednesday. This is protester Sally Davies.
What kind of planet are they going to inhabit? What sort of opportunities are they going to have? So I couldn't forgive myself. I won't be able to look her in the eye when she's older if I didn't come out and do something.
To see all our coverage of Extinction Rebellion protests, go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Turkey has launched an aerial and ground assault on northern Syria, targeting Kurdish-controlled areas. The offensive began Wednesday, just days after President Trump ordered U.S. troops to fall back from their positions on the Turkish-Syrian border. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reports at least 16 Kurds have been killed so far. Turkey is claiming the death toll is far higher. Some of the heaviest fighting has been in the Syrian town of Tel Abyad. Turkish jets and artillery have reportedly hit at least 81 targets east of the Euphrates River. The Trump administration has faced widespread criticism from both Republican and Democratic lawmakers for abandoning the stateless Kurds who'd helped the U.S. fight ISIS. Turkey is claiming the assault is needed to establish a, quote, safe zone in northern Syria where Turkey could relocate Syrian refugees who fled over the past 8 years of fighting. But the Kurds see the offensive as part of a decades-long attack by Turkey to crush their attempts at greater autonomy.
Fear is also growing that the Turkish assault could lead to the mass release of ISIS fighters. Up until now, the Kurds have been responsible for holding over 10,000 ISIS fighters and their families in detention. While President Trump has claimed Turkey will take control of the makeshift jails, there's growing concern many former ISIS fighters will be able to escape during the Turkish assault. At least one Kurdish prison has already been shelled. The New York Times is reporting the U.S. military has moved as many as several dozen Islamic State prisoners to more secure locations. This includes 2 British members of ISIS who are accused of beheading Western hostages, including the journalists James Foley and Stephen Satloff. The Turkey assault is facing international condemnation. The UN Security Council is expected to meet later today. The European Union has warned Turkey's hostilities would, quote, further undermine the stability of the whole region. Earlier today, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has threatened to send millions of Syrian refugees to Europe if Turkey's assault is criticized.
Hey Avrupa Birliği.
Hey European Union, pull yourself together. I say it again. If you try to label this operation as an invasion, it's very simple. We will open the gates and send 3.6 million refugees your way.
On Wednesday, President Trump described Turkey's assault as a bad idea, but defended his decision to shift U.S. troops away from the Syrian-Turkish border. Here in New York, protesters demonstrated on Wednesday in front of the offices of Democratic Senators Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand in New York City, demanding the U.S. defend the Kurdish autonomous region known as Rojava. This is Özlem Göner, an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at CUNY, the City University of New York.
Kurds have lost thousands, tens of thousands of lives, their homes, their lands, their agricultural production, so all their livelihood in order to defeat ISIS so that European and U.S. citizens are comfortable in their homes. And now they're once again paying with their lives for having protected our lives.
We're starting right now with two guests. In London, we're joined by Elif Sarakan, a Kurdish women's movement activist. She's an anthropologist at the London School of Economics. In Brussels, Belgium, we're joined by Ertuğrul Kürkçü, the honorary chair of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, known as the HDP. He's a former member of parliament in Turkey. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Elif Sarakan, let's begin with you. Let's start at the beginning, what we understand and what you understand is happening on the ground now. You have this conversation last Sunday between President Trump and the Turkish president, Erdogan. And apparently Trump tells him the U.S. will pull troops back in northern Syria. And Erdogan makes very clear he's going to attack this area with Turkish troops. Explain what has happened since.
I mean, just to give it some context, you know, this is not a new development. Erdogan has been trying to push for this for many months, if not years, and finally, somehow through quite a mysterious and unclear phone conversation, Trump agreed to withdraw the few U.S. soldiers that were positioned there. And just to make clear that the U.S. Army, the U.S., Trump himself, the Syrian Democratic Forces and Turkey were well aware that these troops still remained posted there essentially to act as human shields to stop a Turkish invasion. Now, what we saw yesterday was the beginning of this invasion, the long-promised invasion by Turkish President Erdogan. And, you know, as many people have said, as there's a consensus all around the world and with public opinion, is the consequences of this can be grave and will be grave. It's not only that it's essentially threatening a Kurdish genocide. It's not even just a possibility. It will create and cause the resurgence of ISIS. It will add to the international refugee crisis. But also, equally as importantly, it will crush the democratic, ecological and women's liberationist experiment that has been happening there, as well as the Kurds fighting against ISIS.
Elif, the situation is quite extraordinary. A U.S. NATO ally, Turkey, is relentlessly attacking, with U.S.-made arms and ammunition, a U.S. ally, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, who were also trained and armed by the U.S. Now, what do you understand is happening today? In these last 2 days, what do we know about casualties, both civilian, Kurdish civilian casualties, as well as casualties among the SDF?
So it's because the situation is unfolding so quickly, it's quite difficult to get any precise figures at this moment, but some of the official figures that we've had in the last 24 hours is that there's over 10 civilians that have been killed. There's at least 15 injured civilians, and also CNN reporter Clarissa Ward was going through part of the region yesterday and reported quite horrific scenes of civilians killed but left on the street because people can't get to them because the shelling is so intense. And in terms of the SDF, again, we don't know the exact figures. We know there's clashes. There's 6 coordinated attacks in 6 border areas. of northern Syria, and the Turkish army with its allied jihadi forces don't seem to want to stop by any means.
I wanted to bring Ertuğrul Kürkçü into the conversation and get your response to what President Trump is now just saying. Kurdish forces have fought alongside the U.S. against ISIS for nearly half a decade, nearly 11,000 fighters dead. On Wednesday, Trump criticized the Kurds, saying they didn't help the United States during the Battle of Normandy in World War II. This is Trump speaking to reporters at the White House during an event in the Roosevelt Room.
Now, the Kurds are fighting for their land, just so you understand. They're fighting for their land. And as somebody wrote in a very, very powerful article today, they didn't help us in the Second World War. They didn't help us with Normandy, as an example. They mentioned names of different battles.
And he also said, the Washington Post is reporting the U.S. military has no plans to intervene if Syrian Kurdish forces leave their posts guarding ISIS prisons, raising the question of what will happen to the 11,000 ISIS militants and their families currently detained in some 20 prisons and camps under Kurdish control. So the President Trump was asked about this Wednesday.
ISIS fighters escape and pose a threat elsewhere.
Well, they're going to be escaping to Europe. That's where they want to go. They want to go back to their homes, but Europe didn't want them from us.
Ertuğrul Kürkçü, you're honorary chair of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party. If you could respond to both of these points, that the Kurds didn't help the U.S. at Normandy in World War II, and if the ISIS prisoners get freed, they will go to Europe.
Yeah, this is horrific, not only for the Kurds, but for all the world and for the Americans themselves, that they are governed by the most ignorant person in the world as a statesman. He doesn't even know that the Kurds didn't have a state. They were not a party to the Second World War. They were enslaved by 4 different countries in the Middle East. And he is now speaking about the war in Normandy and why the Kurds weren't there. So he is totally ignorant of the realities of the world order, which was based on the outcome of the Second World War. And secondly, he has no understanding of ISIS and what it means for the civilized world and Middle East and Europe, why ISIS is a problem not only for the United States or Europe, but for the United Nations. ISIS is one of the 2 groups. One is Al-Qaeda and the second one is ISIS, which is pinpointed by the United Nations as the terrorist organizations whom should be stopped by international cooperation, and that's why the United States is having a function in the Middle East. This was not Trump's own idea. What I would like to say that it was the worst idea also by the Obama administration to intervene in the Middle East affairs, to export regime change in Syria, which deeply changed all the course of things in the Middle East and in Syria. And at the middle of the road, the Obama administration changed their course and took the ISIS as the enemy number 1. This was a better understanding of the course of things, but Trump doesn't understand why this was a immense problem for the American interests, as well as the Syrian interests and as well as the Kurdish interests. So it's a pity that the United States and the world is now is between the lips of an ignorant and reckless person who is the leader of the United States, the number one country in the world, which assumes huge responsibilities for the peace in the world, for the stability in the region, and for a world where people will have to live in reconciliation. So now Donald Trump himself may be the biggest problem for the Middle East peace.
And his response, what will happen to ISIS prisoners that escape from prisons, that they'll simply go to Europe?
Actually, the real situation in the field is even more problematic than Donald Trump believes to be. They are not only going to escape to Europe, they are going to operate in Turkey. And until this day, during ISIS massacres, around 200 Turkish people, 99% of whom are government dissidents, have been killed. And today, in a very interesting statement, the Turkish Minister of Domestic Affairs, or the Interior Minister, in response to a question says ISIS doesn't have any other opportunity than to cooperate with us because they are at loggerheads with all the world, so they should coalesce with us. Now we have a country led by a government, an interior minister who believes ISIS will be their ally. So we have done two problems. One is the Turkish official approach to ISIS, a kind of an ally against the Kurds, and the second one is Donald Trump, that ISIS is a European problem, so that Europeans should tackle with the problem. It doesn't mean anything for Donald Trump, but he forgets 9/11, I think. They were in the United States and caused the lives of 3,000 Americans. It's a pity that really this guy is leading the United States where into an abyss, I see.
We're going to break, then come back to this discussion. Ertuğrul Kürkçü, honorary chair of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, is speaking to us from Brussels, Belgium. And Elif Sarıkan is a Kurdish women's movement activist speaking to us from London. We will also be joined by Debbie Bukcin, co-founder of the Emergency Committee for Rojava. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Benim için korku bir şeyler karşısında sessiz kalmak, karşı koyamamak. İrade olarak zayıflık göstermek, herhangi bir şey karşısında, yani davayı savunamamak. Biraz siyasal korku aslında, siyasal ölüm korkusu. Fiziki ölüm korkusu biraz açtığımız şeyler, alışık olduğumuz şeyler.
Hirvayan by Miranda de la Frontera. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guests are Ertuğrul Kürkçü, the honorary chair of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, joining us from Brussels in Belgium, and Elif Sarıkan, a Kurdish women's movement activist. Also, Debbie Bukcin is with us in New York, co-founder of the Emergency Committee for Rojava.
I'd like to ask Elif, you said earlier, of course, that there is a real risk of a Kurdish genocide given what's happening. And it's important, I think, to remind people that over 10,000 SDF fighters have died in the fight against ISIS. And the question is now, given this overwhelming Turkish assault in northeast Syria, are the Kurds likely to receive any support from anybody? Some have said that they're likely to be forced to turn to Assad in an attempt to defend themselves against this assault. Could you talk about whether you think that's true and what the implications of that would be for the Kurds?
So, Amy, as you say, there's been 11,000 people martyred in the fight against ISIS. There's 22,000 wounded in this fight, including many international volunteers from the US, from the UK as well, and other countries included. Now, to see what the consequences of a Turkish invasion will be, we don't have to look too far. In January 2018, the Turkish army, again allied with ground jihadi forces, invaded Afrin, causing in a couple of months killing 1,000 people, mostly civilians, causing the displacement of 300,000 people out of a population of 800,000, again, mostly Kurdish people. So even at that time, and now it continues, the Syrian Democratic Council, which is the umbrella formation that also includes the Syrian Democratic Forces, have said they will negotiate and they will sit at a table with any actor in the region to bring about a peaceful solution to the conflict and the situation of the region, and and the effects of it on the wider Middle East and also the world. So this does bring the question of the ultimate aim of all of this needs to be, of course, as we said, the US soldiers were acting as human shields essentially, but that was always going to be a solution that expired. So the solution must be that, and the recognition is that this is in some ways less about the US but more about the Turkish invasion, if that makes sense. So therefore the solution must be, whether it's including Syria as well and Russia and the US and the actors in the region, including Turkey too. Why not? To be able to come to a political, diplomatic and peaceful solution to the future of the people of Syria in general, which means the Syrian Democratic Council being included in the rewriting of the Syrian constitution and being included in political developments of the region as well. And this is one of the reasons why the situation has got to where it has got to today, because there was a tactical alliance between the US and the Syrian Democratic Forces in the fight against ISIS. But strategically, there was never any political alliances. And this is what needs to be developed right now, because the question isn't, I don't think the question should be whether US soldiers should return there or not. Of course, as a short-term solution, that would push back the invasion and therefore save the lives of millions of people. But ultimately there needs to be a political solution, and that's what the people of northern Syria and the Syrian Democratic Council have been continue to call for.
Well, Elif, as you know, one of the principal objectives that Erdogan has said for the military invasion is creating a safe zone to which millions of Syrian refugees can be returned. But there have been numerous reports of Turkey recently violently deporting thousands of Syrian refugee men and boys back to Syria. Turkish border guards have reportedly shot and killed Syrians when they tried returning to Turkey to reunite with their families. Now, you've spent time talking to Syrian refugees who've attempted to flee through Turkey. What did the Syrian refugees tell you about how they've been treated by Turkey?
So I was in a refugee camp in Greece in 2016, and I spent a short time with them and, talking with them, discussing with them. Most of them at this camp happened to be Kurdish, but there was also Syrian Arabs and other peoples at this camp as well. And it was it was almost every single person we spoke about the brutality of the Turkish authorities at the border, of when they were trying to cross the extortion of these people, confiscating their belongings, their goods, if they had any gold or money on them, to obviously try and live and look after their families. A lot of the time these were confiscated. They reported things like working at some of these, trying to work at local places, and because there was no protection, their wages not being paid, and so therefore shooting refugees trying to flee into Turkey in the first place is not a new thing. Now the forcing of Syrian refugees back into Syria, again, almost entirely is not a voluntary move. So Erdogan declaring at the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 24th of September with a map essentially declaring that he was going to alter the demographic of this region and quote-unquote settle his Syrian brothers and sisters in this region is absolutely unprecedented, because often world leaders do not declare beforehand that they're about to commit war crimes. Firstly, a unprovoked attack is obviously by definition, by the UN and Nuremberg Principle, a war crime, but also to force the movement of people involuntarily and also to alter the demographic of a region is, again, by definition, ethnic cleansing. And Erdogan declared all of this publicly at the United Nations a few weeks ago. But for some reason, he can do it and get away with it, which to us on the receiving end seems bizarre. But it also seems like he's very, very good, as you've already mentioned today, at blackmailing Europe with the 3.5 million Syrian refugees that he holds in Turkey, unfortunately in very bad conditions, but nonetheless they're there, and he's somehow preventing them from getting to Europe.
I also want to bring...
It's also...
I wanted to bring into this conversation Debbie Bookchin, co-founder of the Emergency Committee for Rojava. Her father, the late political philosopher Murray Bookchin, helped to inspire the Kurdish movement in Rojava. She just returned from there a few months ago and wrote a piece for the New York Review of Books titled "What the West Owes Its Best Ally Against ISIS." There are many who have not heard of Rojava, Debbie. If you can explain what it is and its significance today and what's happening just this week.
That's right. Thank you, Amy. One of the things that we focus on is ISIS, which has obviously been a critically important part of the United States' relationship with the Kurds. But in addition to discussing what the Kurds have been fighting against, it's incredibly and critically important, and especially to the progressive community and the American left, to talk about what they are fighting for. And that is a society that is really unparalleled right now in the 21st century. It is a society that is focused on the ideals of grassroots democracy, feminism, and ecology.
And explain exactly where Rojava is.
Well, Rojava is along the northern third of Syria. It is now, the Kurds are really helping run a huge landmass, basically a third of Syria, which is another reason why it's absurd that they are not being included as part of the negotiations on the future of Syria. But I think what's pretty critically important, and I am very proud of the fact that a lot of my father's ideas have influenced the Rojavan society. What is critically important is that they are saying that we have to create a society that truly empowers people at the local level. And that means, especially in the Middle East, a feminist society. And I was just there, and I had the opportunity to talk to many people. And if you look at what they are doing there, and if you look at, for example, the social contract, which is their equivalent of our Constitution, it enshrines the rights of women in a way that puts our Constitution to shame, frankly. So really, we're talking about a very progressive society, and I think anybody in the United States, anywhere in the world, who considers themselves a progressive or a feminist should be very strongly behind the Rojava project. So that's one very, very important aspect of it. And I think that the other thing that I just want to emphasize is that, there are not only 10 or 12,000 ISIS prisoners, but there are also 100,000 families that are now being held in camps. And many of these women, there's many children, of course, as well, but many of them, especially the ones who streamed out of Baghuz near the end of the so-called caliphate, the defeat of the caliphate, are very hard core, serious jihadists. So for Trump to say that this is not going to be a problem for us is an absurd thing to say. And you can imagine that they're jumping for joy right now. But I think it's really it is very important. And I would actually like to say that, I think that it's, in a certain sense, to the enduring shame of the progressive community in American left that there hasn't been more support for Rojava over the years. We haven't heard our Democratic candidates really even talk about Syria. And this is and part of the reason that this can be happening, especially after what we saw in Afrin, where the Kurdish army, and it's really mostly a jihadi militia that the Kurds have employed because, as you know, after the coup attempt, Erdogan got rid of a good chunk of his army. So you have essentially thugs who have come in and taken this once peaceful region of Rojava called Afrin and turned it into basically an extension of a Turkish Islamic state in which they've taken away people's rights, in which they've looted, robbed, kidnapped people. And this is what we can look forward to. This is what's going to happen in the rest of Rojava. And it is truly incumbent on all of us who claim to care for progressive values to stand up, to demand a no-fly zone for Rojava, to go to our representatives and say, you know what, tweeting your crocodile tears is not enough. We have to actually become active. And the progressive left should really play a huge role in this. It is not something that we should cede to the Republicans.
I wanted to bring Ertuğrul Kürkçe back into the conversation in Brussels and ask you to respond to what Debbie is saying, but also to talk about the significance of the military that is now invading Syria. We're talking about the second largest army in NATO.
Actually, this is the exact example of what an unjust war is. It has no legal basis. It has no legitimate basis for Turkey's security. It has no aim of bringing peace to any part of the world, but it is just designed for Tayyip Erdogan's domestic ambitions of crowning his presidency with a military victory against people which comprises only 1 of the 100 of its Turkey's population, which doesn't have an army as such, but armed citizens. And Turkey is now seeking to suppress their gains from the Syrian administration for self-governance. Their sin is to self-govern themselves, which is a must in any modern society across Europe, in the United States, even in the Middle East. So now Kurds are being punished because they are becoming a bad example for the northern Kurds, that is the Turkish citizens. The outcome of this war, when looking at the balance of the weapons, the armament balance, Kurds may be in a bad position. But when looking at the matter from the legitimacy of the cause, it is obvious that Turkey has lost the war from the start. Not even an international organization, not a serious government across the globe is for Turkey's crackdown on Kurds in Syria. And all the peoples of the world are for the Kurds' right to determine their future. So in the long term, maybe the Kurds in the short term may be inflicted casualties, but in the long term they are going to gain not only the hearts but also the minds of the peoples of the world, because they present the only viable outcome of the Syrian war. A democratic country with self-governance for every entity in Syria. And this will be understood whatever the Turkish government's propaganda machine would say. They are called terrorists. Imagine in Turkey there are at least 50,000 terrorists in prison. Everybody against Tayyip Erdogan is a terrorist. Even the main opposition party is a terrorist party, but this party tragically said yes to Turkish incursion into Syria. They are both crying for the losses, but also supporting the war efforts of the Turkish government. It is just like the German parliament, which started the First World War in 1914. So I would like to say that even now, at the beginning of this Turkish incursion in the Kurdish-controlled areas, there will be no support, no empathy with the Turkish government efforts for occupying this land. And if the international community understands, comes to the support of a nation which has the right to rule themselves anywhere in the world, then the outcome of the war may change. All unjust wars have been lost by their perpetrators, and this is going to be lost also. But this is going to cost the Turkish people
I'd like
economic
to go,
assets.
Ertuğrul, we'd like to go back for a second to Elif Sarıkan. If you could talk, Elif, about what you expect to happen now. How long do you expect this Turkish offensive to continue?
I mean, if Turkey gets its way, if the Turkish army and Erdogan gets its way, it will continue until they have genuinely achieved the genocide of the people of northern Syria, northeast Syria. But, of course, a lot of this is dependent on the international community as well, and actually, even more importantly, the international community. You know, we've seen that the public opinion is deeply and quite aggressively opposed to this invasion. We've seen a lot of people, you know, very, very close aides of Trump come out very strongly to this, including the sanctions bill that has been put together. We've seen a lot of important academics like David Harvey pull out from conferences in Turkey, and celebrities like Cher who have come out with this. So this kind of solidarity and this kind of public outrage is genuinely important, because the lives of 5 million people are in question, including almost 3 million Kurds, but also not just Kurds, right? It's Arabs, it's Assyrians, it's Turkmens, it's a lot of other Christian groups, it's Yazidis. So there's many people, many historically marginalized communities that are at risk here, because the Turkish army jets are not making distinctions. You know, yesterday an Armenian village was also bombed, including other Christian neighborhoods as well. So this is an all-out war against the people of northern Syria. But as Debbie mentioned as well, and Ertuğrul as well, this is against and aims to crush the beacon of hope that is the system based on direct democracy, ecology, and women's liberation. So I think what's important is that people, you know, a lot of people want to do things, but they don't know exactly how to. It's important to encourage people to academically, culturally, touristically boycott Turkey at this point. And make sure that if there is an international power or a state that is not willing to stop this Turkish invasion, that the people of the world that will come together and make sure that they definitely pay for it.
We want to thank all our guests and also end with the Washington Post report. The Washington Post ran a piece earlier this week headlined, Trump's decision on Syria crystallizes questions about his business and his presidency. The article notes Trump himself has acknowledged his conflict of interest with Turkey. Even after Trump became president, Trump Towers Istanbul remained part of the Trump organization and continued to generate revenue for Trump himself. We'll leave it there. Elif Sarakan, Kurdish women's movement activist, speaking to us from London. Ertuğrul Kürkçe, honorary chair, pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, speaking to us from Brussels, Belgium. And Debbie Bukchan, co-founder of the Emergency Committee for Rojava. When we come back, we turn to the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls after native teen Kaysara Stops Pretty Places was found dead in Montana in August. Her family demanding justice. Back in 30 seconds. Seeking Light by Joanne Shenandoah. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end today's show with the devastating story of Kaysara Stops Pretty Places, a Native American teenager whose family is demanding justice after she was found dead in Hardin, Montana in late August, just 2 weeks after her 18th birthday. Kaysara was a member of the Crow and Northern Cheyenne tribal communities in Montana. She lived with her grandmother. According to her family, Kaysara never came home on the night of August 24th. She was reported missing 2 days later. On August 29th, the body of a young woman was found in the town of Hardin. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that local law enforcement confirmed it was Kaysara. The circumstances surrounding her death and disappearance remain a mystery. Her family believes she was murdered, but says local law enforcement is not treating her sudden disappearance and death as foul play.
Kaysara is among at least 27 Indigenous girls and women reported missing or murdered in Bighorn County in the past decade. Since 2010, there have been also at least 134 cases of missing or murdered Indigenous girls and women in the state of Montana overall. Well, for more, we go to Milwaukee, where we're joined by Grace Boltel, Kaysara's aunt, assistant professor in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And in Phoenix, Arizona, we're joined by Mary Catherine Nagel, citizen of Cherokee Nation, partner at Pipestem Law, a law firm dedicated to the restoration of tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction. She currently represents Kaysara's family. Mary Catherine Nagel, let's start with you. Explain what you understand happened in August.
Much for having us on the show this morning, and let me be clear, the family is certainly the expert on the facts surrounding her disappearance and her death and what they know. But speaking as a lawyer and looking at the legal framework, it's very clear that what happened in August was a complete disregard for not only the rights of Kaysara, but the rights of all Native women when local law enforcement failed to investigate her death and to take all steps necessary to look for her before finding her on August 29th. And of course, her family wasn't notified until September. But the first 24, 48 hours that a Native woman goes missing are the most critical in terms of finding her and locating her. And in this instance, I think we have a pretty severe abdication of duties when it comes to local law enforcement and the search for her, or the lack of search that took place.
Grace Boltel, first of all, our condolences to your whole family. Can you walk us through what you understand took place in August to Kaysara?
Sure. Thank you for covering this story, Amy. Our family understands that Kaysera went missing. My sister reported her missing. She went to Bighorn County officials several times and went in person, and our family has not been told any details. We were finally notified that her body was identified on September 11th, several weeks after she was found. And it's been an ongoing struggle in terms of getting information from anyone in Bighorn County.
And Mary, can you talk about how her case fits into the larger pattern of how law enforcement has been responding to murdered and missing Indigenous girls and women?
Yes, absolutely. Kaysera, like so many of our Native women, sisters, daughters, and aunties, has been caught in this jurisdictional loophole. In 1978, the United States Supreme Court took away tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. And as the United States Department of Justice has reported, unfortunately, the majority of violent crimes against our Native women are committed by non-Indians. And so that means that, quite often our tribal governments, their hands are tied because of the legal framework the federal government has put in place. In this instance, because Kaysera's body was found 5 miles off the reservation, where she was found was within state jurisdiction. But as her aunt just mentioned, the local law enforcement, Bighorn County, for a long time, ever since this was first reported to them at the end of August, has failed to just take very basic steps to conduct an investigation looking into the causes surrounding her death. At the same time, the federal government has also failed to step in. The FBI has said they will not get involved because her body was found 5 miles off the border of the reservation, despite the fact that she's an enrolled citizen of a tribal nation, and there's no evidence to indicate that the crime that led to her death did not occur on the reservation. But this is what happens because we have 3 different sovereigns and a very complicated federal legal framework. The state and federal government, which under this federal legal framework usually have jurisdiction, often displace their responsibility and try to push it off onto other sovereigns, whereas our tribal governments, their jurisdiction has been taken away. And what happens at the end of the day is it puts the burden on our families, which is why Kaysera's aunties and her grandmother and her family members are having to come up with lists of witnesses to interview, come up with ideas of evidence to look at. They are spoon-feeding to the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office the things that Sheriff's Office should be looking into, and the Sheriff's Office isn't even responding with confirmation that they will or will not do simple things like look at her social media accounts or what's on her cell phone. And so this is the sort of legal loophole that our Native women and sisters fall into.
And can you talk about the legislation that's been introduced at the state and federal level? Everything from Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act of 2019, introduced to the House and Senate, Hannah's Act signed into law in Montana. What are these measures? And we only have a minute.
Sure. So many measures are on the table right now. Savannah's Act, really quickly, would require every single United States attorney to implement a protocol, a guideline to follow when a Native woman is reported murdered or missing. And that would require collaboration with tribal law enforcement, tribal government, and state law enforcement. In this instance, you could see how that would be incredibly useful because right now we've got 3 separate governments who aren't necessarily speaking to each other. And in the instance of the federal government, they're completely abdicating their duty to even be involved. And Not Invisible Act, while that doesn't restore, and likewise Savannah's Act doesn't restore jurisdiction to tribal governments or resources so that governments could actually investigate their own citizens who go missing, those crimes. But the Not Invisible Act would create sort of a committee of folks from the federal, tribal, and state levels, advocates, family members, to come together and discuss this crisis because it is a crisis. As you mentioned, we know Bighorn County is actually ground zero for the crisis. There have been so many Native women who've gone murdered and missing in Montana. This can no longer be overlooked.
And Grace Bultel, very quickly before we conclude, what's the family calling for now?
That the U.S. senators and the state elected officials step in and hold Bighorn County accountable. Our tribal communities elect these officials. We put them into office, and we deserve justice for our children.
We thank you both so much for being with us. We'll continue to follow this case. Grace Bultel, maternal aunt of Kaysera Stops Pretty Places, and Mary Catherine Nagel, partner at Pipestem Law. Thanks for joining us. That does it for our broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.